Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
Military didn't lose the war in Vietnam. Senator Towers, who is the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, has made the public statement, and he'll make it many times, that the war was not lost on the battlefield. The war was lost politically in the United States.
Retired General William Westmoreland met with Idaho veterans, the media, and the public in Boise yesterday. Tonight, a report on the man whose name has become synonymous with the Vietnam War. Good evening. The war in Vietnam, which ended more than 10 years ago, is back in the news again. On the national scene, investigation into a multi-million-dollar lawsuit filed by Troop Commander William Westmoreland against CBS News has uncovered literally hundreds of thousands of previously secret documents that shed new light on the conduct of the war. They show, for example, that Hanoi kept meticulous records of U.S. soldiers captured or killed, apparently thinking that that information could be used at some point to bring pressure on the United States. The documents also disclosed that this country dropped chemicals on Laotian soil and considered poisoning a strip of ground across South Vietnam with a mixture of radioactive dust and the internationally outlawed substance known as mustard gas. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were asked to evaluate that idea without regard to its political impact, but they apparently abandoned it after only a couple of tests. In Boise yesterday, Westmoreland was asked about that plan known as Commando Lava, but he said he knew nothing about it. The 70-year-old retired Army Chief of Staff commanded U.S. troops in Vietnam between 1964 and 1968. He was in Idaho to talk with Vietnam veterans and with area businessmen. Westmoreland told his audience, as you heard, that it was politicians and not the military who were responsible for losing the war. But he refused to comment on his suit against CBS, which had accused him in a documentary of deliberately underestimating enemy strength in Vietnam.
It's now in litigation, and when it will go to court, and if it will go to court, is unknown. If it goes to court, it probably will do so in the next several months, according to what I've been informed and according to what I read in the newspapers. Other than that, since the matter is under litigation, I cannot talk about the matter. If I did, my lawyer would fire me. And if he didn't fire me, I would fire him, because this is no time to talk, since the matter is in litigation.
Producer Gary Richardson covered Westmoreland's visit to Idaho and talked with the retired general. Here's his report.
The general kicked off his Boise visit with an address to businessmen, some of whom were being honored for hiring Vietnam veterans. Then, at a news conference, he sounded a theme he was to repeat throughout his stay.
Well, it was about 20 months ago when the Vietnam veterans moved en masse to Washington. And they had a welcome home for themselves. Nobody else would do it. And they marshaled a parade in honor of themselves. Nobody else would do it. And then they dedicated a memorial to their dead without asking the government for a dime, just a piece of real estate. The monument was supported by private funds. In my opinion, that was a turning point. The attitude of the Vietnam veteran toward himself and the attitude of the country at large toward the Vietnam veteran.
At a public forum later, Westmoreland spoke again in support of the Vietnam veteran.
I know there are Vietnam veterans in the auditorium this evening, but I just want them to know, and I want you to know, that those soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, and Coast Guardmen did an exceptional job in Vietnam under unusual circumstances. Unusual because they were not only in a hostile environment overseas, but when they came back, their environment was hostile toward them. Some were abused, many were ignored. You know, that's never happened before in our society. This was a first, and the psychological pressures on that Vietnam veteran were substantial. But they have held their head high, and as time goes by, they're going to hold their head higher and higher. I think the most eminent historian, Douglas Pike, of the University of California in Berkeley, he's, I think, recognized as the most expert intellectual and academician on the Vietnam War and the Vietnamese people. And he has said in a paper that he recently gave at a seminar in Washington, D.C., he said, and I quote, "The American military's performance in Vietnam was particularly impressive. It won every significant battle fought, a record virtually unparalleled in the history of warfare." Senator John Towers, who was chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, has made the public statement, and he has told me he's going to make it again and again and again, that the Vietnam War was not lost by the military on the battlefield. He says it was lost in the halls of Congress. Now let me say, as a veteran of 3 wars, in 1967 and 68 time frame, I can say categorically that, in my opinion, America has never put a more effective force on a battlefield than we had during that time frame.
William Childs Westmoreland has been compared with MacArthur and Patton, and less favorably with France's General Navarre, often credited with that nation's defeat in Vietnam. Among his West Point classmates, Westy was an inevitable general. He rose through the ranks in World War II and Korea to become the U.S. Army's youngest ever major general. With the growing U.S. involvement, Vietnam became the inevitable command. 20 years ago, Westmoreland stepped forward to meet his destiny there. In the early years of his command, a strategy combining search and destroy missions into the countryside and holding actions in populated areas seemed successful. In a trip home in 1967 to report to President Johnson and the nation, Time magazine's 1966 Man of the Year painted a winning picture of the war. He said troop withdrawal might begin within 2 years. In March 1968, following heavy setbacks, though, President Johnson brought Westmoreland home at the age of 54. Some saw the change in command as the only way to change a Vietnam policy that seemed to be failing. But Westmoreland's supporters saw him as a scapegoat and said he had been over-directed from Washington and forced to fight a war on the cheap. 3 months after his recall, Westmoreland was named Army Chief of Staff. Since his retirement from the Army in 1972, Westmoreland has steadfastly waged a battle for public opinion that began in Vietnam 20 years ago and still continues today.
Vietnam was different from any war that we have fought against a foreign power. It was not a frontline war as World War I, World War II, and Korea. It was not a war that the American people could follow on a map. It was not the war that they visualized as typical of all wars, like World War II, where the American people were conditioned by the many World War II movies. About 3 years ago, I was invited to New Delhi, India, to talk to basically a foreign group. There were a few Americans there and a few British, but other than that, there were representatives of South Asia. And there were representatives from most, if not all, of the ASEAN countries, ASEAN standing for Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And after my talk, and during the question period, and then during the social mingling with these people, I had one thing pressed home to me. They said the consensus was that from their standpoint, those members of ASEAN countries, specifically the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand, all of which have been colonized the West of Thailand, they said, as far as they were concerned, we won in Vietnam. And as I drew them out on that, they pointed out that we had made a commitment. We held the line for 10 years. We gave those countries 10 years to mature, develop self-confidence in running their own affairs. As I said before, they'd all been colonized to the West, except Thailand. To make some improvements to their economy, to develop their infrastructure to a greater degree than before, to develop resistance against communist pressures. And that 10 years, according to what they told me, made all the difference. They were ready to resist communist propaganda and communist pressures by virtue of our holding the line for 10 years. And then they saw the North Vietnamese come down to the south and take charge. They saw the boat people, they saw the concentration camps, they saw the invasion of Cambodia, and they concluded they wanted no part of that type of administration, no part of a communist government. Now, those countries are now staunchly part of the free world, and economically they're doing relatively better than any other part of the world. Now let me flash back to the Vietnam veteran that I spoke about at the outset. A man who's had a strange plight. The Vietnam veteran is not the drug-ridden, psychotic outlaw and an unwilling participant in an unpopular war as he's been depicted by some. Listen to this. 91% say they're glad they're served and would do it again. There's no difference in drug usage between Vietnam veterans and non-veterans, according to a Veterans Administration survey. Vietnam veterans are less likely to be in prison than other young men of that age group, according to a survey made by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. 97% of Vietnam veterans were discharged under honorable conditions. That's the same as for 10 years prior to Vietnam. 2/3 of the men who served in Vietnam enlisted. They were volunteers. 2/3 of the men who served in World War II were drafted.
Following the address, Westmoreland answered a question from a veteran in the audience.
At the highest levels in the Johnson administration, decisions were made that it could not be militarily won, that the military was unable to convince the advisors to President Johnson that a land war could be won, and they advised the president to get out of Vietnam and save face as quickly as possible. If that's the case, was it the military's inability to communicate to the government?
I understand your question. I don't think that, I have absolutely no knowledge that the military ever so advised. The political authorities at senior levels in the government apparently came to that conclusion. But I have no knowledge of that ever being advised by the military. The strategy of the Johnson administration was not to conquer Vietnam and unify the two Vietnams through the use of force, and such was not the strategy in Korea. The strategy was to try to force them to the conference table. I personally feel, and this is very clearly expressed in my book, that the bombing campaign could have been very effective and probably effective in doing that, but the bombing campaign was off and on, a thermometer of public opinion at home, which had a major impact. If Mr. Johnson had done what Mr. Nixon did, if Mr. Johnson had done in '68, what Mr. Nixon did in late '72 and early '73, the outcome could have been different.
Those remarks came last night in a speech at Boise's Capitol High School. Producer Gary Richardson also talked with General Westmoreland yesterday. He began by asking the general when he first realized that the United States was not going to win the war in Vietnam.
I had high hopes that we could fulfill our objective, which was a commitment to the South Vietnamese people, up until the August of 1973, at which time I was retired. And that was a Case Church amendment to the Fiscal 74 Appropriation Act. And that removed from the president the authority to do what we had promised the political authorities in South Vietnam we would do, namely come to their rescue if the North Vietnamese broke the Paris Peace Agreement. Now, when that took place, I thought the jig was up.
Looking back, many people now call the of the Vietnam War, the war that nobody wanted. How and why, from your point of view, did we get dragged into that conflict?
Well, it's a long story. In a short program like that, it's rather difficult, if not hazardous, to try to articulate that. But it goes back to a philosophical commitment by Mr. Truman in 1947. It goes back to a very strong statement in support of the independence of South Vietnam by President Eisenhower in '54. It goes back to the Kennedy years, to the Kennedyan inauguration, where he said, "We'll pay any price, bear any burden, support any friend, oppose any foe for the survival and success of liberty." This gave an emotional tone to our commitment. And these are all factors involved, to include the strategy that was adopted, which was a strategy that inevitably made it a long war. And I think most everybody realized that, except the American public may not have realized it.
We heard a lot about the domino theory. Do you feel that the way the things turned out, it actually validated that theory?
Yes. Actually, the domino theory unfolded in Indochina. South Vietnam was lost because the North Vietnamese moved down after we had withdrawn. We had no troops there at all when they moved down, and they took over the South militarily using conventional ground forces. They then took over Laos, and then they invaded Cambodia and took over Cambodia. So they controlled all of Indochina. So there were three dominoes that fell: South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But then it stopped. And it did not move into Southeast Asia. It didn't move into Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand. It stopped. And it stopped because we held the line for 10 years. It gave those countries, all of whom had been colonies of the West, except Thailand, it gave them a breathing spell to develop resistance to communist pressures.
We're hearing talks again about things like the domino theory in Central America. Are there lessons we can learn from Vietnam to apply there?
Well, I think the bottom line lesson, and perhaps the most important one, was that we have to realize, as a people, and our leadership must realize, that we can't accomplish anything in this country that has a large cost unless it has considerable, if not overwhelming, public support. I mean, that's the nature of our democracy.
Do you see us in a war in Central America in the near future?
I don't think so. I certainly hope not, and I don't think so. I think we ought to do everything we can to bolster up those regimes that are trying to resist communist takeover.
What role do you think that public demonstration had in winding down things?
Well, in a comment that I made publicly today in Boise, I said that Senator Towers, who was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, had said that the war was not lost on the battlefield. It was not lost by the American military. He says it was lost in the halls of Congress. Certainly the military did not lose a battle of any consequence. But politically, it was decided that we should pull out, and that was done over a period of time. The first step was to turn the battle over to the South Vietnamese, and frankly, I think that was done in too much of a hurry, where they were really not prepared to defend their shores, their land territory, with the proximity of a hostile Cambodia and hostile elements of the North Vietnamese Army and Laos. And the fact that the Paris Peace Agreement allowed 100,000 troops, or what amounted to 100,000 troops, to stay on South Vietnamese soil, which I think was an unfortunate part of the Paris Peace Agreement.
Where do you come down on the effect of the media on this war?
Well, it is a statement of fact that this was the first war that was piped into the living rooms and bedrooms of America. It was the first televised war. It is a fact that it was the first war that America ever fought without censorship. We had censorship in World War II, and we had censorship in Korea. this war, there was no censorship. The press were more or less given a free rein. And so this was a new experience for the media, it was a new experience for the military, it was a new experience for the politicians. I think there's a lot to be learned by that, and I can't say that I have the answers, but there are lessons to be learned in this regard. Now, as to my analysis of the psychological impact of televising the war on the American people, you're out of my field. I can't address that.
Well, let me ask you something that's a little bit more in your field. How much control do you think that the government in a free and democratic society should exercise over reporting of the activities of that government abroad?
I think we should draw a distinction, and you have implicitly in your question, that there's a little difference between reporting of domestic news and domestic developments and the reporting of foreign news, and particularly there's a difference when our country has made a commitment, an international commitment. And I think that a distinction has to be drawn there. I personally feel that the media should soften, and I would say many of them did during the course of the Vietnam War, should soften their adversarial role to government. I mean, the media does frequently play an adversarial role to government, and that is not a matter to be criticized. It's part of our system. But when a commitment is made to a foreign land and men's lives are on the line, I'm not saying that they should be necessarily censored and denied that, but I think in the future it would be to the national interest that they soften their adversarial role. And I'm not getting into detail to what extent this was or was not done in Vietnam. I think history will pass judgment on that. I'm merely making the point that there is a difference between the reporting of domestic news, where people know what's going on, they know the country, they know that if there's the latest murder, a rape, a bank robbery is on the front page, they know that's not typical of America. But when you make a foreign commitment, I think you've got a little different situation.
I asked the general how the war had changed the way he looks at the world.
Well, it was an unusual experience. There's no question about it. And experiences have an impact on an individual's outlook, perhaps an individual's personality, but the last person that could detect those would be the individual himself. And I happen to be in that boat. But I haven't needed psychiatric treatment.
People have likened the Vietnam War to a national wound that is not quite healed, and I think in that analogy the veteran would be sort of like shrapnel buried deeply in the wound that might lie dormant for years only to cause pain later on. Are we doing enough? Is our commitment to the veteran enough? Should we be doing more?
I think the burden that the veteran has had to carry, the bitter pill, so to speak, was his receptivity at home. I mean, that Vietnam veteran was sent over there to do what the country wanted done, and he did it admirably. The Vietnam veteran can be very proud of his service. You know, the military and soldiers don't commit us to war. That can be done only by political authorities. After all, the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief. And those veterans should have, and I think do have, the satisfaction knowing that they did what they were asked to do. Now, as to whether this was an appropriate commitment, that is a political matter. President Reagan says it was a noble cause. Certainly was in consonance with Mr. Kennedy's inaugural address. It certainly was in consonance with President Truman's doctrine of 47. It certainly was in consonance with President Eisenhower's statement in 1954. The commitment was idealistic, highly idealistic. But when the cost became great, think which was inevitable because of the restraints imposed on the military in fighting the war. When the cost became great, I suppose the American patience was such that they didn't feel that the accomplishment of the full accomplishment of the mission was worth the price.
What about our obligation to the veterans, though? Have we fulfilled our obligation to them now?
Now, by we, I could interpret that as we, the government of the United States, or we, the people of the United States. I think the Veterans Administration has done a pretty good job, particularly for the disabled veteran. And I've had many, many disabled veterans tell me that. As to public attitudes, they were never universally hostile, but there were segments in our society that were quite hostile. But you don't hear about them anymore. American people are beginning to, and many have already manifested that they are very kindly and very sympathetic and very appreciative of the conduct of the Vietnam veteran.
What about our obligation to the Vietnamese American children that were left in Vietnam?
Well, this is a humanitarian matter, and they apparently were not well received in the Vietnamese society, and there's some evidence that they may be persecuted. And if there's evidence that they have an American father, well, I think we should try to bring them into our society if there's a custodian.
One final question. You did touch on it earlier today. The MIAs, the missing in action, are we doing enough about that?
I don't think we've done enough, but I do believe that the Reagan administration is concentrating on that. I feel that we should trace down every lead, every report, every sighting. We should put pressure on the Hanoi regime to turn over to us the remains, those pilots that were shot on, those men that lost their lives in Indochina. I think that we should persist in that effort if it takes us another 10 years. I think that's an obligation of Mr. Reagan's government, and I believe that he's assuming that.
Thank you very much.
Retired Army General William Westmoreland in Boise yesterday. That's all the time we have for tonight. Join us tomorrow night when we'll have a look at the hot economic and civil rights issue of comparable pay for comparable work. I'm Jean McNeil. Good night.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
That's our time for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.